The basement that earned a name. They carried him in under the cold hum of fluorescent light, a boy dragging for air, eyes flinching from brightness as though it were a stranger. The man beside him, gray hair, a neat good coat, one hand steady on the child's shoulder, filled out the form without lifting his gaze. There was no woman, no one who claimed to be a mother. Allergies? None. Home address? Nearby. We won't be long. And that last sentence sounded like an attempt to escape before anyone asked the only question that mattered. According to official records, the boy arrived at St. Aurora Medical Center, Colorado, in the winter of 2010. The first notations from the attending physician read, severe vitamin D deficiency, muscle weakness, indicators of prolonged lack of sunlight. A secondary observation, the kind people don't usually write unless something unsettles them, was underlined. Persistent odor of dampness air without movement. The nurse who clipped on the pulse oximeter lingered an extra beat. The child's wrist was pale in the way skin becomes when light is an occasional guest, not a resident. But what happened next doesn't submit to anyone's logic. The man who signed M. Franz delivered answers with calm, practiced discipline. The boy's mother, unstable. Gone. She drops in with me. I do what I can. He spoke the language people use with officials. Measured, unsharp, obedient. The doctors did their work. Yet the social worker, a professional trained to trust discomfort, noted what wasn't there. No mother. No guardianship papers. No vaccination history consistent with the child's age. And something else, the boys flinch at the word outside, as if street. Named a threat rather than a place. Where do you live? Close by. Where is his mother? Missing a long time. She left him with me. Who else is at home? A pause that the admitting clock counted twice. No one else. On the intake sheet, a line appeared, recommend hold on discharge, verify custody. One phone call, then another. A sentence delivered evenly without accusation. We're not alleging, we're concerned. Concern isn't a siren, but it is often the first real breath of truth. Patrol arrived late in the evening. The stated purpose was modest, a routine child welfare check. Even so, the officer's notes would later include inconsistencies in statements. The man, Matteo Franz, pressed his case with gentle insistence. Tomorrow I have business, the boy is improving, we'll be going. He was accustomed to doors that opened for lawful appearances, to yes sir, and, of course, habits like these behave like keys. They usually work. Not this time. The lab values drew a hard edge across the page. The boy's blood looked like it came from underground. Vitamin D collapse, bone fragility, markers of sensory deprivation. The social worker added, child does not orient to basic references of the outside world. When the sun is mentioned, reacts as if it were legend. The knot tightened, quietly, decisively. A search warrant didn't break like thunder. It began like a cold rain that people ignore until they're soaked. The officer wrote patiently, discrepancies in answers, absence of custody documentation, indicators of possible isolation. A judge signed, and the city map shifted. One ordinary house on an ordinary street was now threaded with a thin line of red. The lawn was always trimmed there. The porch light obeyed 6 o'clock. Neighbors used 3 words: reliable, quiet, polite. At night, when half the hospital sleeps and only the monitors refuse to blink, the boy's breathing settled. The man in the good coat sat straight and still, the posture of someone trained to wait. He did not know that the door he had taught to forget was already an address in a police report. Morning would arrive there in blue flashes. The search began with ordinary rooms, a kitchen too clean to remember meals, a living room whose dusty shelves were missing only picture frames, a hallway rug that did not drift a single inch, as if fixed to the floor by a will other than gravity. Then, a small door beneath the stairs, a lock so practical it was almost invisible. The officer tightened his grip. The key wasn't necessary. Stairs, narrow as a sip. Air, heavy, like it hung from hooks. The beam of a flashlight skimmed the concrete skin of the walls, and space abruptly turned into a place. A bed that had never met the sun. A growth chart scratched into paint with something sharp and patient. An old, stubborn sink, dripping by a schedule known only to those who own no clock. The ceiling had been tampered with, pipes rerouted, insulation layered thick enough to turn a scream into a rumor. "You see?" one officer whispered to another, and the word "see" felt like an accusation. At the far end, a door inside the room. Too many bolts for a private home. On the inner face, scratches. Not one story, but 100 attempts to start one. When the final bolt yielded, the light touched a face, not a woman without a name, but the woman the file would call the daughter. She squinted, not from fear, but from light. It cuts, the first time, for those who have known only its imitation. "We're the police, it's over," they said, the way people always do. But what happened next didn't end, it only surfaced. Officers stopped moving for a heartbeat, arrested by the quiet of the room. Broken toys, bleached of color, a mattress that kept the map of too many nights. The chain on a single bulb, worn smooth by fingers reaching up to check whether morning had come. Someone whispered, "The basement." Another finished the thought, "Of horror." That's how places earn names, when language fails to keep up with what eyes are forced to hold. Some believe the truth was buried forever, and here it had been, laid down in layers, concrete, insulation, locks, and the polished habit of neighbors not to ask. But truth has lungs. On that winter morning in 2010, it drew breath not at the hospital, but here, in the concrete mouth of a home. With each inhalation, light claimed its rights, in the daughter's blinking eyes, in the officer's reports, in the words that would have to explain the explainable. According to official records, it was during the search that an adult woman was freed after years of captivity. A room showed unmistakable signs of long isolation, with evidence of children living there. Journals with ragged dates were seized, along with schedules, hardware for repairs to the door, and tools for keeping sound from leaving. Over police radio, a clipped message. "Contact made. Alive. Needs medical." A pause, then 2 words added. The ones reporters, prosecutors. And those relearning the word son would repeat, "Basement horror." But this was only the story's first breath. Ahead, a case file thick with testimonies, records that vanished and reappeared, and questions sharp enough to cut through concrete. Because when doors finally open, truth doesn't simply walk out, it begins to count those who helped it stay. The paper that lied. Morning split the house into 2 kinds of rooms, those the world already knew, and those it had to invent new words for. The officers worked in pairs, one to search, one to witness, a choreography learned from other scenes that were never supposed to exist. Photographs, measurements, bagged items labeled in block letters that tried not to shake. And all the while, upstairs, the front door stood ajar, a cold draft drawing a thin border between the ordinary neighborhood and what would soon be called, almost by instinct, the basement of horror. According to official records, the daughter was transported to a secure wing for medical stabilization. And forensic interview. The notation is sturdy and impersonal. Adult female, signs consistent with prolonged confinement, photosensitivity, nutritional deficits, delayed orientation to time markers, scars of unclear origin. A nurse who wrote it later recalled only one thing with color: the way the woman's eyes wandered to the window, not to look out, but to confirm that out had a place to be. Downstairs, the inventory kept lengthening. There were notebooks, ruled pages filled with doleful. Slanting handwriting. Lists titled supplies, fixes, rules. There were calendars where entire seasons were circled, then crossed out with a line so heavy the paper tore. One page read only, "Quiet means safe." Another, "Sunday is the day we pretend the sun is here." In the margins, small tallies that could have been anything. Days, punishments, contractions counted on a floor without clocks. But what happened next doesn't submit to anyone's logic, because logic depends on clean histories, and the house gave only palimpsests. The kitchen drawers were immaculate, organized with the care of a person who prefers measured edges. The basement shelves were apocalyptic, jars without labels, a collection of mismatched screws, 3 spare padlocks in their blister packs, unopened. On one workbench, a coil of insulation and a folded invoice from a hardware store. Cash sale. No name. The wife. Yes, she existed, and for the first day it seemed impossible that a living spouse could be an unknown element. Sat on the sofa with a blanket and a vacant teacup. He told me she ran away, she said. He said she was sick before that, wayward. You know how girls get. She said the last sentence as if quoting a language from a country she no longer believed in. I did the laundry he brought me. I never went downstairs. That was his space. When asked why, she answered with the logic of marriages that once made sense. Because he said so. Neighbors formed a ring at the property line, unappointed jurors, staring at a door that had never before interested them. He was reliable, one man said, a phrase that had already begun to rot with overuse. Always waved, a woman added, as if waving were a moral deed. A third voice, younger, unsure, mentioned strange deliveries, insulation in summer, a portable heater in spring. A long, narrow door, carried in one afternoon and never carried out. We thought he was finishing the basement, the young man said, then looked at the reporter's microphones and seemed to understand the cruelty of that sentence. Investigators pulled records the way miners pry boards from an abandoned shaft, careful not to bring the whole place down on themselves. Utility usage for the house told its own awkward tale. Electricity high in odd months, water low, then lower, and in winter, a stubborn baseline warmth, even when the thermostat upstairs said otherwise. According to official records, a building inspection had been scheduled years earlier, and then deferred at owner's request. The deferral letter was missing. So was the inspector's signature. We have gaps, the district attorney would later say, as if gaps were a feature, not a design. Meanwhile, the boy in the hospital began to breathe like a person who had met air for real. He spoke in small pieces. Basement, he said, then lifted his hands as if to show the size of it and failed. Because basements do not fit between the palms. Rules, he said next, and traced invisible lines in the air. Lights off quiet, don't wake the pipe. The social worker asked who the pipe was. He pointed up, to the ceiling. If the pipe wakes, the door sounds angry. Children, when they cannot name a prison, name its noises. The paperwork tried to reassert control. Birth certificates, photocopies, some convincing, some shaky with counterfeit haste, began to surface. 2 appeared to assign the boy to Mateo as guardian by necessity. A third was a clean adoption for a different child, notarized, stamped, utterly legal. He loved those kids, a neighbor said, pointing at the form with the zeal forgiven only to the uninformed. The detective nodded, not in agreement, but in confirmation. Love is a word systems prefer when they would rather not check the basement. In the county archives, a clerk unearthed an old manila folder with a rusted fastener, a 1980s employment history for Mateo Franz, maintenance, facilities, a note about excellent punctuality, another about self-sufficiency with repairs. In the margins, someone decades ago had penciled, quiet, reliable. The word followed him like a charm. It opened locks no key could fit. It told everyone not to ask questions they would have to take home to their dinner tables. But what happened next defies any logic. An accountant with the task force began matching dates. The year the daughter vanished. versus the year a new storage room was added beneath the kitchen. The permit existed. The inspection stamp did not. The contractor listed front range improvements had dissolved 5 months later, its registration address leading to a P.O. box that now belonged to a travel agency. When officers questioned the travel agent, she shrugged. "We get old mail all the time, sometimes from people who don't exist." Then came the counter stories, as they always do when horror is forced to live beside daily life. A cousin no one had seen in years claimed the daughter had been unstable since adolescence. A neighbor's sister insisted she'd heard music from the basement in the early evenings. It can't have been so bad if they had music. Someone else said the house was haunted because the mind, when it meets a concrete wall it cannot pass, invents a ghost to step through it. Conspiracy grew like mold in the shadow of fact. A missing inspection letter. A contractor that vanished. A memory of a police call years ago that went nowhere. According to official records, the interview with the daughter was halted twice for medical reasons. When it resumed, the air in the room felt brittle. She spoke with the precision of someone who cannot afford waste. He led her down the stairs on her 18th birthday. He said, "Help me with storage." He locked the door and created a vocabulary where good meant quiet and safe meant obey. She described births conducted with only towels and a bucket. Punishment rationed out like calendar days. And in the first winter, a light bulb replaced with a dimmer that clicked. So I would know whose day it was, mine or the house's. Some believe the truth was buried forever. And in a way, the truth collaborated, accepting the names it was given. Runaway, unstable, mercurial. But truth has a spine too. Speak. Prosody, rate 2%, pitch -1st. Each small verification stiffened it. Break time 260 milliseconds. Soil samples with traces of human skin cells. Break time 500 milliseconds. A footprint measured against a shoe the daughter had never seen. Break time 500 milliseconds. A receipt for vitamin drops tucked inside a Bible whose pages fell open at the Book of Job. Break time 380 milliseconds. The task force began to see the shape. Break time 260 milliseconds. Not an impulse. Break time 500 milliseconds. Not a break. Break time 500 milliseconds. But a system engineered and maintained by a man who counted days the way other men count coins. Break time 380 milliseconds. The district attorney called a preliminary conference, just a room. Break time 220 milliseconds. A table. Break time 220 milliseconds. Affidavits in neat stacks. The hum of a vending machine, like an indifferent witness. Break time 380 milliseconds. Charge him, someone said. With what? Someone else answered. Not because there were no crimes. Break time 220 milliseconds, but because there are too many ways to name them. On the board went words that refused to share a line. Kidnapping. Unlawful imprisonment. Break time 500 milliseconds. Aggravated assault. Break time 380 milliseconds. Sexual assault. Break time 380 milliseconds. Child endangerment. Break time 500 milliseconds. Fraud. Break time 500 milliseconds. Conspiracy. Then a final term no one wanted to be first to write. The one that makes even seasoned faces age by a year. Incest. Break time 380 milliseconds. But what happened next would move beyond paper again, to something that bleeds on the edges of procedure. Because systems can count and stamp and file. Break time 500 milliseconds. But they cannot tell you why a city learned not to look at its own basements. They cannot explain the lock that fits so easily into everyone's day. The interrogation was scheduled for morning. Mateo requested coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, and asked, almost politely, whether he could wear his good coat. Quiet. The man who spoke in straight lines. According to official records, the interview room measured 12 feet by 10. Cinder block, painted the color of old paper. 1 table bolted to the floor. On the table, a recorder with a red light, a pad of graph paper, 2 pens that would never run out of ink during business hours. Across from the detective sat the man the case file now called subject, M. Franz. He folded his good coat across his lap, a gesture of civility, almost domestic, and asked whether the thermostat could be raised. "I'm not used to the cold," he added, as if anyone in the room were. What happened next does not submit to anyone's logic, because logic assumes that truth jumps when cornered. It does not. It settles into a chair, and, if you're not careful, it lets a different story speak for it. Matteo began with a prologue the city already knew by heart. "My daughter was troubled. She ran away. She dropped children at my doorstep. I did what I could." The detective did not interrupt. Time is a tool. Let a man arrange his own rope. Then a page turned. "Did you ever restrain your daughter?" "No." "Did she ever live in your basement?" "No. We stored things there." "Who is the mother of the boy in the hospital?" "A woman who did not stay." "Name?" "I never knew it." The graph paper recorded the angles of his lies. Tidy, equidistant, built to look convincing from a distance. But the room had brought its own geometry. A video from the body cam of an officer walking the narrow stairs. A photograph of a door with bolts that could only be set from the outside. The inventory list with the words soundproofing foam, repeated too many times to be coincidence. "We found your daughter," the detective said finally. Not an accusation, just an angle of truth sliding under the skin. "She has a name. She used to have a birthday." He did not flinch. People expect flinching. Guilt as choreography. It is rarer than movies teach. Instead, a small cough, a measured sip of water, and a sentence carved to look responsible. If there were misunderstandings, they were for safety. People do not understand what danger looks like today. He gestured toward the blank wall, as if the century were standing behind it, nodding. "You kept her under your house for 24 years, the detective said. "A beat." "That is one interpretation," Matteo answered, and in that phrase, a lifetime of straight lines tried to redraw a circle. Meanwhile, the daughter, in a room with no mirrors, because mirrors are cruel at first, learned the new grammar of daylight. Doctors treated the body. Another team tended to time. How to say yesterday, without thinking of a bare bulb. How to say tomorrow, without waiting for keys. According to official records, the notes stayed clinical. Refeeding protocol, ophthalmology consult, physical therapy. Unwritten, but remembered by the nurse who sat with her in the quiet hours, a hand lifting to the window, not to reach, just to measure, as though sunlight were a substance you could learn to portion. The children ate in the ledger, but not all in the same chapter, began to resolve into people. 2 had clean adoption papers signed years before. 1 lived with a family who kept a mantelpiece of school photos and used the word blessing without irony. Another had a guardianship order that named Matteo as caretaker by necessity, a phrase now collapsing under the weight of evidence. The boy in the hospital, the catalyst, started to sleep through the night. He asked about the pipe once, then twice, and then, when the ceiling did not rumble back, he stopped asking. Silence can unteach fear. It just takes longer than anyone wants. Outside, the neighborhood rearranged its memory. Reporters staked the curb and aimed their microphones at a parade of corrective recollections. "We thought he was widowed," someone said. "No." A second corrected. "We thought she traveled." A third swore she had once heard a woman's voice and taken it for a television program. "We are not detectives," a man snapped when a camera lingered too long on his fence. He was right. But fences have their own truths, what they block, what they permit, what they ask you not to think about when you pass. The task force mapped the basement as if it were a foreign country newly discovered under a kitchen. They gave names to its features: the north bed, the east wall tally, the utility corner, the inner door. They logged the dimmer switch that clicked like a metronome for obedience. They measured the distance between the ceiling insulation and the floor. Tall enough for a man to stand, low enough for a woman to forget that the sky has no boards. Soil samples returned with traces that did not belong to soil. A lab report, read aloud in the conference room, made one seasoned officer pinch the bridge of his nose and leave. But what happened next defies any logic. A missing inspection letter suddenly existed, scanned to a computer at the county office, on a date that would have made its author a ghost. The clerk who found it went pale. "This stamp is wrong," she whispered. The district attorney's investigator held up the printout to the light, a ritual, not a technique, and saw what he had expected, a forgery smudged with the confidence of someone who knows paperwork can silence questions. Conspiracy, once rumor, became itemized. The P.O. box that had belonged to a dissolved contractor opened into a chain of borrowed addresses, mailbox stores, a shuttered travel agency, a strip mall office that once sold tax relief and now sold silence. In the interview room, the circle tightened. "Your daughter says you brought her downstairs on her 18th birthday," the detective said. "She remembers a cake." For the first time, Mateo's eyes changed. Not softened, not hardened, recalculated. "People misremember," he said. "Trauma makes stories." The detective slid a photograph across the table, a paper plate found in a sealed tub, its rim decorated with tiny balloons. A child's hand had written a name. The rest of the letters had been scrubbed away by bleach. "Whose plate is this?" Silence. "Then, we reuse things in my house. Waste is a sin." According to official records, the charges were drafted that afternoon, then redrafted to hold your weight. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, first-degree sexual assault, aggravated child abuse, 8 counts of endangerment, fraud, conspiracy. The word no one wanted to write did not vanish because of reluctance. It waited on the whiteboard like a storm several counties away, visible, inevitable. When it was finally written, the room felt colder. Language had caught up. It would not make anyone warmer. The arraignment drew a crowd that pretended to be the public. Mateo wore a different coat. Not good, just good enough. He did not look small. Men like this rarely do. He looked organized. He looked like a filing cabinet that had learned to walk. He entered a plea that made a sound people mishear as strength. Not guilty. Somewhere, in a wing without mirrors, the daughter learned that sentence existed and did not ask what it meant. Some meanings are a luxury. Some believe the truth was buried forever. The city, embarrassed by its own confidence, searched its other basements with new eyes, a flurry of calls to tip lines, knocks on doors that had never been knocked on, a rumor about a house on Maple that turned out to be an elderly woman's pantry. Systems stirred, school records cross-checked with pediatric visits. A memo circulated to ERs about signs of indoor deprivation. It felt like action. It also felt late. The interview ended without confession. It almost always does. The detective clicked the recorder off and thanked him for his time, a courtesy that sounds obscene until you realize manners are the only stable furniture in a room like that. As Mateo stood, he smoothed the coat across his arm, a straight line, perfect and useless. Outside, the weather changed. A small wind found its way between courthouse bricks. Inside, a calendar turned to a date that would later be circled too hard. The day a city stopped believing that a neat lawn meant anything at all. Building the year that didn't exist. The case moved from rooms to corridors, from the basement to the courthouse, and the city learned a new pace. Slow, procedural, relentless. According to official records, discovery began with 17 bankers' boxes, then 23, then a room of shelves labeled with tape that curled at the corners. Each box held a fragment of a year that had never been allowed to exist above ground. Logs of light hours, written in a slanting hand, food tallies measured in lines, not cups, a calendar with every Sunday circled, and a penciled note, "Pretend we feel the sun." What happened next does not submit to anyone's logic, because logic expects a straight story once the door is open. Instead, the story multiplied. The defense filed its first motion, exclude prejudicial terminology, which meant don't say basement of horror in front of a jury. Don't say dungeon. Don't say cell. Say room. Say storage. The prosecutor countered with photographs, bolts facing outward. Insulation, layered like a muffler. The inner door with scratches that would have been redundant if hope were not repetitive by nature. The judge listened, a quiet man, the kind whose face only shows judgment in the space between sentences, and then allowed both words and pictures to breathe. Meanwhile, the wife, who had not known how to inhabit a headline, returned to a house that was now a scene. She moved through it as if trespassing in her own hallway. "He told me to keep upstairs," she repeated, the phrase hardening each time like a layer of plaster. "He told me," she ran. In her second interview, she added something that made the room lean forward. "Sometimes the lights flickered. He said it was the old wiring. We never changed it." An investigator would later stand in that hallway with an electrician and hear a different sentence. Someone rerouted circuits to keep a lower level alive, steady, unblinking. According to official records, a utility lineman had once knocked at that door in 2001 to ask about irregular usage. The note read, "Customer cordial, says he keeps a workshop." The workshop was cataloged now. 3 unopened padlocks and blister packs, a coil of soundproofing, a bin of wire ties, a jar of keys that opened nothing on the main floor. In the bottom of a milk crate, sealed in a zipper bag, lay a small brass tag stamped with a number that matched an old city inspector's badge. The inspector had died in 2009. The tag had no business being there at all. Rumors tried to fill the gaps the way water looks for a crack. A neighbor said a radio would sometimes hiss through the night when the power blinked. Voices in the vent. She told a reporter, then blushed at the drama of her own words. A clerk at the county office swore the inspection letter had printed itself onto the queue with a timestamp that didn't match any logged login. A former coworker said he'd seen Matteo read manuals for an entire lunch hour, cover to cover, then recite the page numbers like prayers. Some believe the truth was buried forever. Others believe it finds new disguises each time it's unearthed. The task force built what they called the map, a wall-sized timeline where yellow bands marked ordinary life and gray bands marked underground time. They pinned birth months estimated from medical scans and dental wear. They pinned the adoption dates and guardianship orders that had lived on the surface like innocent leaves attached to a root no one had bothered to trace. Across the top, they strung a wire and clipped photographs with black binder clips, the dimmer switch, the bucket, the paper plate with balloons, the name bleached away to a ghost of letters. The wire sagged under the weight, as if refusing to pretend the burden was evenly distributed. Medical notes thickened into a counter-narrative. Vitamin D levels rose with supplementation. The boy's bones, young enough to forgive, began to remember strength. The daughter's eyes tolerated longer visits from daylight. Physical therapy taught her gait the geometry of stairs that do not end in a lock. But trauma kept its own glossary. Day 1, she asked permission to speak. Day 3, she requested the light be left on, not bright, not dark, a compromise between weather and memory. Day 7, she asked whether Sundays would still be Sundays now that the sun was not a ration. The therapist paused before answering, because language can bruise if it doesn't watch where it steps. But what happened next defies any logic. A parish priest volunteered that years earlier, Matteo had come by the church office with a request to bless a small renovation, a private space for contemplation. The priest had declined, explaining that blessings were for people, not rooms, a little joke that felt less little in retrospect. A landscape crew chief said he'd been paid cash to haul away broken concrete in 1990, wheelbarrows of it, but couldn't recall from which part of the property. The receipt had been stapled to an invoice from a company that no longer existed. A firefighter remembered a call for a faint smell of smoke. Wiring, he said, with no evidence of fire, and the oddest thing about the visit, the man had insisted on showing them where to step in the hallway, as if the floor had rules the house had not disclosed. The defense hired a psychologist who wrote in dense paragraphs about pathological altruism, an argument that would try to recast confinement as misguided protection. The state's expert wrote a single page that began, "Protection would have opened a door." The judge allowed both into the record. The jury pool filled with people whose faces learned a new stillness. The voir dire questions felt like a census of belief. Do you think some families are unknowable? Do you believe paper proves reality? Have you ever ignored a sound you could not explain? Upstairs, in the evidence room, where climate control replaced conscience, a small plastic clock sat on a shelf in a bag. When an officer had removed its battery, the hands froze at 2:17, a meaningless time until the daughter, shown a photo later, whispered. That was the hour he liked for quiet. Quiet had an hour. So did noise. On a different shelf, a child's book about the sun, its cover bright, its edges gray with handling, lay beside a photograph of a ceiling with insulation pulled tight like a second sky. According to official records, a DNA panel confirmed the obvious with a cruelty only numbers can manage. The prosecutor read the results without raising her voice. The court reporter took it all down in a shorthand that looked at a distance like rainfall. An advocate sat with the daughter and did not translate the science. She translated the verdict of the body into a sentence the heart could hold. You were not wrong to call it a prison. Outside, the lawn that had convinced a block nothing was wrong went to seed. Reporters moved on for a few days. A city cannot stand at one curb forever, but the mailbox filled with letters anyway. Apologies. Accusations. Prayers folded into quarters. One envelope held a photograph from a fair 2 towns over, a carousel, a father holding a child up to the mirror of a brass pole. On the back, saw him there once, not sure, thought you should know. Memory, once asked to work, volunteers too much and too little. Night fell the way it always does when a town is learning to count its basements. Streetlights came on, windows blinked. Somewhere, in a room without a lock, the daughter slept with the door open, on purpose, as a lesson to her lungs. On the map, the gray bands waited for names that would make them feel like history and not weather. The prosecutor sharpened a pencil that did not need sharpening. The defense stacked motions like sandbags. And the judge, that quiet man, turned to a fresh page in his calendar and wrote a date that would tilt the city's axis again. The day 12 strangers would be asked to look at a room with bolts and decide what kind of word it deserved. 12 seats facing a door. According to official records, jury selection concluded on a gray Thursday. The sort of day that makes buildings feel heavier. 12 seats were filled, 2 alternates set aside like spare lungs. A teacher, a machinist, a retired nurse who had once worked nights in an ER and kept her hands folded as if to remind them not to reach for anyone. They swore the oath, each syllable measured, and looked toward a door at the far end of the courtroom, a door that did not lock, did not bolt, did not pretend to be anything but a hinge. The symbolism was unintentional. It was also impossible to ignore. The prosecution opened with restraint, a decision that felt like respect. No theatrics, only the geometry of proof. A house, a room. A woman whose birthdays had been counted in scratches. You will hear that the defendant is reliable, the district attorney said. The word held between fingers like something fragile that had already cut the city once. You will see what reliability built. On the screen appeared the inner door, too many bolts for any home that believes in mourning. A murmur moved like a small wind through the gallery. The judge lifted a hand. The wind died. What happened next doesn't submit to anyone's logic, because logic wants evidence to sit still. It doesn't. It breathes. It remembers. It resists being read only once. A crime scene tech described the layers of soundproofing. Foam, insulation, a secondary barrier tucked behind a false wall, and then, almost apologetically, added, the workmanship was precise. Precision, in that sentence, sounded like a sin. An electrician walked the jury through the rerouted circuits, how a person could keep one world lit while the other pretended to sleep. He pointed to a diagram. A juror flinched when a pencil tapped the symbol for a switch. According to official records, the daughter's testimony was scheduled for late morning, when the light through the high windows was kindest. She entered with an advocate, sat, and placed her hands on the rail as if it were the first piece of furniture ever offered without a price. The court reporter set fresh paper. The DA asked the first question, not what happened, but what would you like us to call you? The answer was a name with syllables the room learned to carry gently. She spoke in straight lines because labyrinths waste oxygen. 18th birthday, help me with the storage. The first lock, the first night, the first rule, quiet means safe. He told me that above was danger. She said, eyes on the polished wood paneling. He said there were people who would take me away for my own good, and that below was order. Her voice did not break where the room expected it to. It broke 3 sentences later, on a word no one had anticipated. Sunday. She explained the game, pretending the sun was present, rationing smiles so the children would believe in weather. A juror pressed a knuckle to her mouth and stared at the ceiling as if names for mercy were written there. The defense rose, careful, practiced, and offered a different angle. Misunderstood protection, a troubled daughter. A man who did the wrong things for the right reasons. You were free to leave at times, were you not? The attorney ventured, the question delivered with the politeness of a hand extended over a trap. There were stairs, the daughter said, and there were locks. But the house had other doors. Doors, she answered, are not exits if the keys are stories. The transcript captured the pause that followed as simply, silence. But what happened next defies any logic. Because logic also expects paper to save or condemn by itself. It can't. It needs witnesses made of breath. A pediatric endocrinologist translated numbers into a childhood the boy had not been allowed to have. Calcium like a frayed rope. Bone density like winter branches. Markers consistent with indoor childhood. A phrase the courtroom had not known it would hate. A psychologist for the state refused metaphors. Confinement, she said, is not ambiguity. It's a clock without hands. The defense's expert responded with an essay about over-control as anxiety management. And the judge allowed it in, not because the court believed it, but because fairness is a structure stronger than outrage. Meanwhile, the city kept collecting coincidences until they looked like theory. A maintenance log from 1991 surfaced with Mateo's signature and a notation. Excellent with locks. A permit file from 1993 sprouted an addendum no one remembered authorizing. A school enrollment office found a folder stamped incomplete for a child never enrolled. The emergency contact lines were filled with a single name written 3 times. As if repetition could conjure a second adult. According to official records, a thin envelope arrived at the DA's office mid-trial. No return address. A photocopy inside of an old invoice. Sound dampening panels. Bulk order. Cash. The store had closed in 2002. The back of the copy bore a faint imprint from a different page. A shopping list written hard enough to echo. Pads, batteries, bleach, balloons. Balloons. The room leaned. The DA laid a photograph beside it. The paper plate with its rim of tiny circles. The bleached-away name. Coincidence, the defense said. The jury did not move. The wife testified with a careful terror. The fear of being blamed for not being the person the story needed earlier. He said she ran. He said she was sick. I believed those sentences because I knew how to live inside them. Did you ask to see the basement? No. Why? Because I didn't know that no could be questioned. The defense tried kindness, a deliberate strategy, almost persuasive, and asked whether she had ever seen a bruise. Not on the surface, she said. The answer landed in the room like a slow, heavy thing choosing a place to rest. Some believed the truth was buried forever. and the trial seemed determined to argue both sides of that superstition. A retired inspector, white hair like a confession, took the stand to say he remembered being assigned the house and never finding it on his route. The docketing system had crashed that week. A clerk shrugged on video. "We did paper catch-up." "Speak. Prosody rate -2%, pitch -1 first." Things slipped. A former coworker of Mateo's recalled a break-room conversation about home repairs and the pride in the old man's voice when he said, "Break time 220 milliseconds. A quiet home is a safe home." The phrase returned like a refrain nobody wanted to hum. Break time 380 milliseconds. The boy's short video was played. A carefully edited statement. Private entry was undergoing. Voice tiny but steady. The courtroom learned what it means to hold breath as a community. Break time 380 milliseconds. "Basement," he said. Phrase. He looked up past the camera, toward a ceiling that did not lower itself anymore. The pipe slept. The door got mad if we were too loud. Break time 380 milliseconds. Sundays were Sundays. Then, a blink that reset the world in miniature. Break time 380 milliseconds. "Is it always this bright?" he asked someone off-screen. The jurors did not look at one another. They looked at the table because wood is strong and doesn't cry. According to official records, chain of custody for every seized item was immaculate. Break time 260 milliseconds. Each zippered bag told a story in permanent marker. Exhibit 14, dimmer switch, audible click. Exhibit 22, notebook, chiming, rules pitched in the perfect hand. Exhibit 31, brass tag, number matches deceased inspector's badge. Break time 380, but paper could not carry the heaviest exhibit. Absence, no photographs of birthdays above ground. No school art stuck to a fridge. No sunlight scuffed into a windowsill by small elbows. Absence, the prosecutor implied. The prosecutor implied. Should be read as loudly as any scream. Prosody. What would happen next, the DA said in closing for the day, is what happens when a city decides that neatness is a virtue and curiosity a vice. She paused, not for effect, but to make the sentence fit inside the room. We are not here to debate words like dungeon or room. We are here because a door that should have opened did not. For 24 years. She let the number stand alone. Numbers, when they're honest, do not require adjectives. Evening lowered itself over the courthouse, a slow curtain. The jurors were dismissed with instructions not to read, not to discuss, not to let the world pour new colors into what they had just seen. They walked past the public benches, where apologies and anger sat without speaking. Outside, the flag hung at windless attention. Inside, a bailiff turned the key in a lock that clicks as softly as good manners. A lock that keeps the world out, not a life in. The difference can be explained to a child. It is adults who need trials to remember it. The silence between two stories. According to official records, the defense began its case on a Tuesday that smelled like rain. The kind of weather jurors later remember without being able to say why. Their first witness was a former coworker who spoke of Mateo, as if reliability were a craft. He fixed what broke, the man said, never raised his voice, brought his own tools, always labeled. The labels became a theme. A neatness offered as character witness. A person who alphabetizes bolts, the defense implied, cannot be the architect of chaos. But what happened next doesn't submit to anyone's logic, because logic assumes neatness and harm are opposites. They are often neighbors. The prosecutor asked whether the man had ever been inside the house. No. Had he ever seen the basement? No. Had he ever asked about the daughter? We don't pry. The room felt the sentence settle. We don't pry. A civic lullaby, hummed without malice, lethal without intention. The defense leaned into the gaps as if they were proof of innocence. The missing inspection letter, counsel argued, showed bureaucratic error, not conspiracy. The dissolved contractor, a failed small business, nothing more. The notebooks, lists any caretaker might keep. Rules could mean safety, schedules could mean routine. They wanted the jury to imagine a difficult household managed by a man with a stern, misdirected love. He kept a roof over many heads, counsel said. He fed them. He clothed them. The words balanced on a line that hoped no one would ask who built the roof over the basement and why it touched the ceiling. According to official records, midweek, a sealed envelope arrived at the courthouse clerk's station, postmarked 2 towns over. Inside, a photocopy of the storage unit rental agreement from 1994, signed M. Franz. The DA obtained a warrant. The unit's door rolled up with the reluctant groan of a memory. On the concrete floor, a cardboard box with water damage, its contents wrapped in plastic like a poor man's time capsule. Inside, a cassette recorder, 2 tapes, a stack of paper plates with balloon rims, and a small brown envelope of Polaroids that showed nothing but corners and ceilings. The recorder, when tested, offered only a mechanical hum and the soft click of a dimmer being turned on, off. On, off, as if someone were trying to teach silence to count. The defense objected, relevance, prejudice, and the judge took a long pause before ruling. The tapes were admitted for limited purpose, not to prove motive, not to prove character, but to situate a pattern, a schedule of light, a discipline of sound. A crime scene tech explained the background noise like a meteorologist describing wind, a fan, a pipe, a resonance consistent with a low ceiling. Meanwhile, the city rehearsed superstitions. A talk show caller claimed the house sat on some bad line, a fault of spirit, not rock. A neighbor swore the street's crows had always perched on Mateo's roof, counting, she said, the way they do before storms. A pastor preached against secrets and included a line that felt accidentally aimed. Darkness is organized, dear friends. Some believe the truth was buried forever. Others, desperate to domesticate it, invite a ghost to take the credit. The court dealt in what could be sworn, not what could be felt. According to official records, the jury viewed the basement in person. They were bussed under guard, instructed not to speak, not to touch, to see without leaning on their own hearts. The room had been stabilized, catalogued, emptied of anything that could be lost, and yet it still breathed its history. The etched growth tallies, the dull shine on a chain worn smooth by years of fingers, a square patch on the floor where a rug had once taught small feet their borders. One juror pressed a palm to the wall and withdrew it quickly, as if the concrete had a pulse. No comment, the bailiff said. The phrase was a rail they could hold to cross the space. The wife, called again in rebuttal, brought a paper bag of receipts she had found in a closet back seam. He hid things in the house, she said quietly. The receipts were unremarkable in isolation. Bleach, bulbs, locks. Together, they drew a calendar. One was dated the daughter's 19th birthday. In the memo line, he had written only, supplies. The DA asked whether she had ever bought balloons. No, she said, confused. We didn't celebrate. The paper plates answered for her. But what happened next defies any logic. Because logic wants timelines to settle, the case kept finding new hours. A retired mail carrier remembered delivering a heavy padded envelope to the house in late autumn, years ago, addressed to workshop. The sender's name was a manufacturer of sound-dampening panels. A cousin, long estranged, produced a Christmas card torn in half. The visible half signed Ateo, the first letters missing. On the back, someone had practiced a first name over and over, like a child learning letters. The ink bled from a felt tip marker that had run too long in one place. It was a common name. It was also the daughter's. In the hospital wing, without mirrors, the daughter learned a new act of faith, going outside. Physical therapy gave way to a walk on a courtyard path bordered with carefully indifferent shrubs. She looked up. It took time. The body resists change, even when change is rescue. She lifted a hand to shade her eyes. The hand shook, not with fear exactly, but with the shock of abundance. According to official records, a nurse wrote, "Tolerates daylight extended exposure," then added a human sentence they did not usually include. smiled at a flock of birds. The boy drew pictures for the first time with colors the basement had not owned. He drew a pipe, not angry now, just a line crossed by smaller lines, not quite a ladder, not quite a tree. He drew a door with no knob, and then, beside it, a second door with a knob so large it looked like a moon. "Which one is real?" the social worker asked gently. He tapped both. "This one," he said, pointing to the knob. "And this one," he added, pointing to the blank door. Children understand that reality is additive. Trauma remembers in plural. Back in court, the defense presented their psychologist again, now with a phrase sharpened to a point: shared delusion. The suggestion was that a prolonged insular environment had created false narratives once outside eyes intervened. The DA answered with a physician who did not raise her voice. Broken bones do not participate in delusion. Then with a forensic audio analyst who mapped the cassette hum to the house's basement ventilation fan, a model discontinued in 1995. Then with a handwriting expert who matched the slant in rules to the slant on a signed check Mateo had written to a hardware store. The jury's faces did not move, but something behind them did. Furniture being rearranged in a room where no one is supposed to live. According to official records, a brief power outage struck the courthouse late that afternoon. Emergency lights held. The recorder's red eye blinked once and resumed. In the silence between electricity and its return, the gallery breathed as one organism and then remembered to separate. Later, a court officer would say he had felt, for a second, as if the room were below ground. He did not put it in any report. Reports prefer measurable darkness. Evening diluted the day. The judge warned counsel to prepare for closings. The map on the task force wall, yellow bands for the world above, gray for the world below, had acquired a new color, a thin red thread stitched along the bottom. The days since the basement door opened, some believe the truth was buried forever, the DA said to her team as they packed files, as if reading a proverb to steady a hand. It wasn't. It was managed. Outside, a wind knocked lightly at the courthouse flag and moved on. Inside, the calendar turned to a date circled without dignity or ceremony. The day when two stories would be placed side by side and the quiet between them asked to testify. The hours that would not pass. According to official records, closing arguments began at 9:02 a.m., a time chosen not for symbolism, but for scheduling. The DA stood with a stack of photographs that had learned to speak for themselves. The inner door with bolts facing out, the dimmer switch whose click became a metronome for obedience, the etched growth marks on a wall that had pretended to be a calendar. "This is not a misunderstanding," she said, voice level, palms open to the exhibit table. "This is engineering." She did not dramatize. She recited. A house. A basement. A daughter. 8 children. An arithmetic that ends, always, in a lock. She walked the jury through the geometry of harm. Rerouted circuits. A map of secrecy. Insulation. A barrier the body could not argue with. Sound-dampening foam. Intention made into texture. According to official records, she said, and each time the phrase rang like a hammer finding the same nail. Paper had been weak when it tried to tell the truth alone. Paired with bolts, it was enough. The defense answered with gentility sharpened to a point. They asked the jury to see a difficult home rather than a prison, to hear rules as structure, to imagine a frightened patriarch improvising protection against a world he mistrusted. He fed them, he housed them, he kept them, counsel said, lingering on the verb that hoped to masquerade as mercy. They gestured toward gaps, the lost inspection letter, the dissolved contractor, the P.O. boxes, and suggested bureaucracy, not conspiracy. Where the state wants malice, you may find error. The sentence looked reasonable in the air. It did not fit on the floor. But what happened next defies any logic, because logic expects speech to finish the work. It never does. The judge's instructions were long and exact. Elements, burdens, Lesser included offenses, the vocabulary of a structure that prefers careful edges to righteous corners. He reminded them that sympathy was not evidence, that outrage was not proof. He reminded them of the presumption that wraps itself around every defendant like a garment the law insists on lending. "You will decide what weight to give each item," he said quietly, "and you will return a verdict consistent with reason." The jury filed out, 12 backs disappearing through a door that closed with a soft courtesy at odds with the city's pulse. According to official records, deliberation began at 1:16 p.m. 2 bailiffs stood post. The hallway hushed itself. Reporters drifted to the curb and began narrating absence. The wife sat in a bench corner with her hands clasped as if she could keep time from spilling. In the secure wing without mirrors, the daughter stared at a window and practiced a new skill, not anticipating footsteps. Inside the jury room, a table, 12 chairs, a carafe that made coffee taste like procedure. The first vote was not a verdict, but a temperature check. Paper squares folded, unfolded. Numbers. Then the work. Elements on the wall chart. Exhibits requested. Transcripts flagged. Exhibit 31, a foreperson said into the intercom, the brass tag with a number that belonged to a dead inspector. The tag returned in its plastic sleeve like a small metal echo. A juror held it up to the light. The number did not change. Exhibit 14 came next, the dimmer switch. The click in the quiet room sounded indecent. Some believe the truth was buried forever. The room, cautious to the point of superstition, refused that comfort and refused its opposite. They asked to hear the boy's recorded statement again. They asked for the floor plan of the basement, the inner door, the utility corner, the north bed. They argued gently at first, then with the seriousness of people, deciding whether words like forever have legal equivalents. One juror drew lines on a legal pad. R for locks, O for lies, R for silence. Another listed the adjectives used by both sides and crossed them out until only nouns remained. Lock, bolt. A man swore the crows had moved to a different roof since the search. Even they knew, said, to make him so. A woman sang a hymn softly, 3 benches away from the courthouse steps. 380. A neighbor told a camera she remembered a humming in summer nights, like a fan that never rested. And then, suddenly ashamed, apologized to no one and everyone. Till 21. She said. The word collapsed on the sidewalk and did not it up. According to official records, at 3:41 p.m., the jury asked for a readback. The daughter's answer to the question about other doors. The reporter obliged, voice steady, pages whispering. Doors, the transcript said, are not exits if the keys are stories. The room went still. Then came a second request. The endocrinologist's explanation of indoor childhood. Numbers again. Calcium, density. D. A. Juror, a machinist by trade, circled them like dimensions he could cut steel to. Another rubbed the edge of a photograph as if texture could be consulted for truth. But what happened next was the kind of pause that devours hours. The foreperson called for a meal break and no one left the table. Food cooling in cartons began to smell like decision. A late afternoon shadow climbed the jury room wall and reached the clock. Someone breathed. 24 years, not to sway anyone, just to keep the number from drifting. They returned to count 1, kidnapping, and followed its elements like footholds on a cliff. Then count 2, 3, and the ones that carry ash in their syllables. They did not say the last word aloud. They placed a finger on it and moved on. Meanwhile, the daughter stepped into an interior hallway with a therapist and learned a domestic magic, choosing whether to close a door. She closed it halfway, opened it again, left it ajar. The act required muscles courtrooms cannot measure. According to official records, a nurse marked vital signs normal and wrote nothing about the quiet triumph. In another building, a child colored a sun with too many rays and asked if they could be counted. "You can try," the social worker said. He tried. He stopped at 8. "That's enough," he decided, and smiled as if he'd discovered mercy. Twilight found the courthouse first, then the street, then the faces waiting without looking at each other. Reporters shifted their weight. A bailiff cracked the door and closed it again. The building breathed. Inside the jury room, chairs scraped, paper rustled, pencils paused above squares where boxes waited to be filled. The foreperson looked at the empty lines that asked for a word heavier than ink and lighter than a sentence served behind concrete. Some believed the truth was buried forever. 12 disagreed, not with speeches, but with a tally that formed itself, slowly, then all at once. At 8:12 p.m., a note appeared. "According to official records, we have reached a decision." The hallway woke like a body coming back from cold water. Counsel reassembled, the wife's hands unclasped and clasped again. A reporter's voice cracked on a rehearsal. In the secure wing, someone touched the daughter's shoulder and spoke the sentence that opens a different door. "They're coming back in." The judge returned, robed dark as a thought. The courtroom rose, the ritual that forgives no one and comforts less. The foreperson stood, a paper in hand that shook just enough to prove it mattered. The verdict would be read, but the hour held itself, one last breath, and even the building seemed to lean toward the sound it already knew it would have to carry. After the door opened, according to official records, the courtroom reconvened at 8:19 p.m. The judge asked the question he asks in every case that hopes to be ordinary. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson said yes. Paper changed hands. The clerk stood, and then the words came, steady, spaced, arranged so that breath could find its way between them. On count 1, guilty. On count 2, guilty. The punishing rhythm continued, a metronome of accountability. False imprisonment, aggravated sexual assault, child abuse. Fraud, conspiracy. When the last count was read, the room did not exhale. It released something older than air. He did not look small. Men like this rarely do. He looked organized to the end. Posture, a filing cabinet. Hands folded in the grammar of self-control. The judge thanked the jury and reminded them, as he always does, that they had done their duty according to law. Somewhere in a wing without mirrors, a nurse turned down a light and told the daughter, with the plainness kindness learns from hard rooms, "It's over." But what happened next does not submit to anyone's logic. Because over is a word for calendars, not for houses that learn to breathe without windows. Sentencing arrived weeks later with the weight of arithmetic. According to official records, decades stacked upon decades, terms to be served consecutively. Parole eligibility projected onto a year the city refused to pronounce out loud. The law had built a cage and then checked its welds. The judge spoke of harm, of planning, of the architecture of control. He spoke, with care, of names the file had learned to say without breaking. He did not try to say why. Courts don't do why. They do what and for how long. Outside, winter lost its edge. The lawn that had once argued for reliability was cut by a city contractor and left plain. No borders, no story. Neighbors returned to their versions. "We suspected nothing," some said. "We suspected everything." Others confessed, as if suspicion could retroactively reroute electricity. A child on the block sketched a house with 2 doors and colored one blue, one black. He asked whether basements always have locks. No. His mother answered. He asked whether locks always have keys. She did not answer at all. Meanwhile, the daughter learned the rituals of a life with doors that swing and stop only when asked. Breakfast by a window, curtains not as barricade, but as choice. Walks that obeyed weather instead of a dimmer's click. She slept some nights with the hallway light on. Not bright, not dark. A truce between memory and sleep. According to official records, refeeding complicated by old scars, ophthalmology improvement. Physical therapy progressing. The notes did not mention the first time she laughed at something small. A grocery bag that tore at the corner, and spilled oranges that chased one another along the floor like escaped sons. Some believe the truth was buried forever, and yet, even in victory, the story kept finding places to hide. The missing inspection letter, the version that should have existed, never surfaced. A former clerk insisted she had seen it once, years ago, on the left side of a drawer that stuck. She could not prove a drawer. The dissolved contractor's corporation number led to a box at a defunct mailbox store. The building had been repainted a hopeful yellow and now sold pet supplies. An elderly man recalled installing a ventilation fan in a basement for a prayer room, and then, when shown a photo of the model, grimaced and said he must be misremembering. But the hum in the cassette, on-off, argued like a clock. There were other rumors, arranged like low clouds no one wished to name. A neighboring county reopened a case file about a woman who had disappeared after a long silence. A break room rumor said a different address on the same street once filed a permit for a storm shelter. That failed inspection, but somehow was never re-inspected. A man in a hardware store remembered a customer who bought locks in threes and joked about insurance against chaos. He could not swear it was Mateo. He could not swear it wasn't. But what happened next defies any logic, because logic wants the world to agree once a gavel falls. It did not. The defense filed appeals, ineffective assistance, prejudicial terminology, basement of horror, in headlines that never entered evidence, but somehow entered everything. The appellate judges wrote carefully about bolts and doors and soundproofing, and the phrase, "a clock without hands." They affirmed. Paper, at last, held. The house waited, empty but not idle. The city placed a sign in the yard, property sealed. Then a second sign, future use under review. For months, people drove by and didn't slow down. Then, one afternoon, a car stopped and a pair of tourists leaned out to take a picture. The flash was pointless in daylight. The photograph showed paint, shutters, a mathematically innocent porch. In the bottom corner, if you zoom too far, a pale moth appears caught in the motion of a wing. The internet decided it was an omen. The city decided not to decide. A charity truck hauled away the furniture that had never learned to hold comfort. An evidence team, returning for items previously deemed irrelevant, removed a square of drywall and found behind it a child's drawing. Lines that wanted to be a ladder. A circle that wanted to be a sun. Tape had left its heavy gray on the paper's edges. No one wrote a report about the drawing. Instead, an officer slid it into a personal folder and told herself it would be returned later, when there was a place in the world where it felt right to hang. According to official records, the daughter chose a new name in a small hearing that lasted less than 10 minutes. The judge smiled, not a courtroom smile, but a human one, and told her to sign the order when she felt ready. She signed without shaking. The advocate hugged her in the hallway and did not say congratulations, because survival is not a party. They went outside. A breeze moved left to right like reading. The sun was neither ration nor rumor. It was weather. The city learned to live with its basement. Schools added an hour of unannounced questions to training days. What makes a lock a lock? When does neatness become a wall? ER nurses updated their intake sheets with a line no one wanted to fill. Sunlight exposure. Adequate, inadequate, unknown. A pastor's sermon included a sentence that finally refused metaphor. Darkness is organized, and so must be attention. People nodded. People forgot. People remembered again when a fan hummed too long at night. And yet, questions remained. Harder now that a verdict had set the perimeter. Who signed the letter that never was? Who taught a man to layer foam until a scream turned into weather? Who waved back and did not notice their own hand practicing the same polite arc? There were rumors of a second storage unit key, a duffel that was never found, a utility bill spike in the summer of a year no one could agree on. There were the crows, of course, the ones a neighbor swore had counted something on the roof for years. And then, after the search, moved 3 houses down and started over. Some believe the truth was buried forever, but perhaps the harder belief is that truth survived underground and learned to breathe on its own. It waited for a night when a child could not catch breath, for a nurse who wrote concern with enough ink, for an officer who opened a door beneath a stair. And now it waits again, not in a basement, but in the quiet inside people's homes, where a question could be asked or ignored. The house will be demolished, the rumor says, or converted to offices, or preserved, a plaque to warn and to wound. The plans change with the week. If you pass by at dusk when windows begin to confess their lamps, you might hear, or you might imagine you hear, a click, faint as a coin against glass. On, off. On, off. A metronome for attention or for forgetting. The street has learned to keep walking. The city has learned to put dates on things. And the rest of us are left with the only sentence that fits, and fits poorly. The door opened, the light rushed in, and what remains is not darkness, but the map of where it learned to live.